Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Chelsea and I'm the head of marketing here at Culture Shift. If you don't know about Culture Shift already, we partner with organisations to give them a speak up platform so that they can understand their culture through data. And the topic of today's webinar is 5 ways to embed ED&I into your company all year round, a topic which clearly resonated with quite a lot of you, as we had quite a lot of people registering for today. So just a little bit about me and why I'm hosting this webinar. So I've been at Culture Shift as the head of marketing for just over 5 years. And I'll be talking today from my experience and what I have learned about embedding ED&I into organisations over my time here. I also often and will throughout this webinar talk a little bit about psychological safety, which is something I believe is intrinsically linked into inclusion. But I'll only touch on it. So if you are interested in that topic specifically, that is something that I spoke about recently on an episode of our new podcast, actually. So we can share the link to that. And there's a lot of other really great episodes as well. So in pulling together the content for the webinar today, we tried really hard to think outside of the box and specifically to think outside of the tick box. There are a lot of people on this call who have many more years experience in equality, diversity and inclusion than I do. But the perspective that I'm hoping to bring today is from my experience of observing over 100 organisations now that Culture Shift partners with to embed inclusion practices to various degrees of success. And that's a perspective that I hope is a slightly unique one. As you all know, improving ED&I and embedding it throughout your workplace culture is not an easy thing to do, and it's not a quick thing to do. And in the 5 or 6 years that Culture Shift has been going, I don't claim that any of our partners or indeed ourselves have gotten that 100% perfectly right. But there are some really good examples that I've picked up on of good work over the years. And we really wanted to put on this webinar today because over that time, we've built up quite a large community of ED&I professionals. And what we've come to understand from them recently is that it's getting harder than ever to have an impact in their work. I'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but there's a lot more awareness of the prevalence of issues and therefore a lot more pressure to do something these days. But that pressure doesn't necessarily come with the time nor the funds to do something meaningful. And that is really hard. One thing that I thought might be useful in that spirit of community is for people on the call today, if you're happy to do so, to share your biggest ED&I challenges in the comments. And if we don't cover them today, then we can look to do that on a future webinar. And the second reason for putting on this webinar is I also understand that ED&I practitioners are getting a bit fed up of only getting sign off on those flash in the pan initiatives that, while they make people feel happy and even a sense of inclusion and belonging in the short term, they don't necessarily have an effect all year round. What I didn't want to do today was to sit here and talk to you about inclusive hiring practices, effective interview techniques, and things like that are usually covered on these types of webinars because there's so much research and content about that stuff online. So if that was what you were hoping for, then I'm happy to point you in the direction of guidance on those types of things. But hopefully what we cover today will be slightly different. So let's get into it then. So first of all, when I was doing some of the research for this webinar, I came across this statistic from CIPD in 2020, which says that half of employers don't have an ED&I strategy in place. And when you consider all of the data about how important diversity and inclusion is for business success, tons and tons and tons of data and statistics around that, which I'm sure lots of you are familiar with. A particularly strong one that I like to use is that diverse teams make better decisions 87% of the time. And when you consider that, it seems really low that half of employers aren't even thinking about this at all. And I say that they're not thinking about this at all because I believe that to be doing ED&I properly, you have to have a strategy in place. And so that's going to be the first talking point for today. So, like I've said, in order to embed equity, diversity, and inclusion all year round, I firmly believe that you have to get the strategy right. And it's my opinion that without a well thought out strategy, you can't truly make purposeful, tangible, and measurable progress to improve those things in the workplace. And I don't think you can just start to do ED&I in a silo and expect it to be as effective as I know everyone on this call wants it to be. So having a strategy is important, and having a strategy that has a clear purpose is really important. I think if you want it to run through everything that you do as a business, which in my opinion is the way for it to be embedded all year round, then there needs to be a clear and a unique purpose as well to the strategy that resonates with your team. So that's the first of two core parts to an ED&I strategy for me. One, that it's a strategy with a clear purpose, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. And two, that it's led by and part of your overall business plan. So when it comes to finding out the purpose for your ED&I strategy, we can take from the work that Simon Sinek has done around finding out the purpose for businesses overall. This is something that as a marketer, I've been familiar with for quite a few years, but probably a lot of people on the call will have heard of this as well. So Simon Sinek talks about people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And I think that we can use this to create the why for our ED&I strategy. And this whole principle is why, the first thing when you go on the Culture Shifts website is to create a world of work and study that is safe, happy, and supportive for everyone. It's not to provide organizations with our reporting platform. There's loads and loads of research on this and loads of really good YouTube videos if you want to look it up some more. But the two kind of key things that I wanted to highlight that I think are really important in finding out your why is one, to ask a lot of questions, and two, to seek out new perspectives. The great thing about co-creating your ED&I strategy and the purpose for your ED&I strategy with the people in your organization is that you will end up with a why that is very unique to your company, and it will be based around the issues and challenges that your people are facing today. Just to share an example of that. So Culture Shift is still a fairly young and scaling business. We're in the process at the moment of taking on our fourth round of investment. And each time we take on a round of investment, we have an external advisor placed onto our board. And we don't have a lot of control over choosing who that person is. And sometimes to our team, this looks like a board that's growing in headcount, but is not always representative of them. And we know because of feedback that we've received that that is something that members of our team want us to improve going forward. So one of the lines in our ED&I vision is around recognizing the strength in diversity and embracing and celebrating different identities. And one of the measures of success that we have to back up that point is that every stage of career, we will seek to remove barriers from our processes and create opportunities for people to progress and grow with us. What that then means is our team know that there's a plan and a path for them to progress and them to be that representation on the board. Another example here. So this is something that a line that I think would be in quite a lot of ED&I strategies. It's a common initiative to have employee resource groups across the business. And this for me sits somewhere between a how and a what. But a equivalent why might be to amplify the voices of the marginalized people in your organization to ensure that they are heard by senior leadership. For full transparency on Culture Shift's ED&I vision, in case it's helpful, this is the whole thing, but for me it kind of boils down to the line that I've highlighted in yellow there, which is that our best work happens when we feel a sense of inclusion, and the purpose of our ED&I strategy and vision is that people feel included and do their best work here, so that we can achieve our ambitious growth plans and achieve that grand vision that I talked about before that's on our website of a world of work and study that's safe, happy and supportive for everyone. So my first recommendation would be, if you don't already have an ED&I strategy in place, then speak to your leaders about creating one and creating one with input from across the business. And if you do have an ED&I strategy, just check that it has a clear purpose that resonates with the wider business. And if it doesn't, then look to hold a workshop to determine this and co-create this together. That will make it so much easier then for you to talk about that all year round and really have it embedded into the culture of the business. And then the second point that I want to talk about is linking your ED&I strategy with your business strategy. For me, the two things, they'll be in separate documents, right? But they can't exist in separate universes. And you have to have an ED&I strategy that's rooted in the overall business strategy for senior leaders and everybody in the organization to buy into it. So my first piece of advice around this is actually look at your business strategy and look for mentions of equity, diversity and inclusion within it, because if you don't have a ED&I strategy, the likelihood is there will be a business strategy that exists and there'll be a document that you can go and have a look at. If it's in there, which even if it's not explicitly in there, which I'll go and show on some examples in a second, it's probably going to be in there in a roundabout way. So then when you're going to your senior leaders and saying, we need to have an ED&I strategy, I want you to give me the time and resources to create one, you can say, and it's going to support this goal and this and this objective of the business plan. And so these are just some examples of where I believe ED&I is intrinsic throughout Culture Shift's 3-year business strategy. So these are all lines that are taken from our business plan that everyone in the business has access to. So this is an obvious one, we are diverse in our thinking and problem solving, but also we go on to talk about we want to attract and have retain passionate people who deliver on our vision and proud high-performing teams. And diverse, equitable and inclusive teams are so linked with high-performing, happy and productive teams. And so how are we going to achieve those strands of the business strategy if we don't have an ED&I strategy to back that up? We also talk a bit in our business strategy about always innovating and learning from our failures. And that for me is having a psychologically safe environment where people can fail, share that, feel open about speaking up about failures and new ideas and learn from them, so that others can learn from them too. And like I mentioned at the beginning, that psychological safety part is so intrinsic with inclusion. You have to be building a safe and inclusive space in order for innovation to happen. And then the final one, which is maybe a less obvious one, but in our business plan, it says that we want to have supported and engaged customers. And those customers need to be supported and engaged by a team that is representative of them and that collaboratively understands all of their challenges and goals. And so there's 6 different objectives of the business strategy that need to be supported by an effective ED&I strategy. The second way that I want to talk about embedding ED&I all year round is to talk about accountability. So you have a strategy in place, but the ownership of that strategy and the ownership of the activity within it really matters. So what do we mean about ownership or accountability? I think there are 2 core parts to accountability. One part that I strongly believe in is having a person, a senior leader, ideally the CEO, who is passionate about driving a diversity and inclusion agenda that spearheads this whole thing and is ultimately accountable for it. And if your CEO is not this person, then I think there need to be some conversations, potentially challenging conversations, with them, that being this person is the right thing for them to do. And we'll come on a bit later, I think it's point 4, around resisting pushback to these initiatives. And there might be some helpful tips in there to help with these kinds of conversations. But I believe that the CEO should be ultimately accountable. And then they decide, with the help of the wider team, who's responsible for delivery. And then the second part to accountability for me, other than having that sort of spearhead figure, is that you can't be accountable without having clear targets for how you're going to measure success or failure of this strategy and of these initiatives. Our own ED&I strategy has measures of success within it, but what is lacking and what the next step for us is going to be is making sure that there are smart, measurable KPIs associated with those objectives. And my ask was going to be in the chat as well, if anybody wouldn't mind sharing their examples of key KPIs, key goals, key metrics that really help keep their company accountable to embedding ED&I all year round, then I think that would really help others on the call. So yeah, the person who's responsible for accountability, ideally being the CEO, if not an extremely senior leader, and then having clear targets set that reflect business strategy. And then it's about determining who's responsible. And there's not a clear answer or recommendation for this. There seems to be a few different ways that organizations do it. So some organizations have one role, one ED&I role, and there's some data about how that's increasing. So in 2020, there was a 58% increase in ED&I roles available, which is a good thing. I think a lot of people on the call today are in those roles. But we do know from our community that people in those roles often feel quite alone, quite lonely in doing this ED&I work, and that they need better support from others. So I'm not sure whether that is the best route or in isolation is the best route, but I think it's a positive step that more and more organizations are having specific roles for this. I think that that's better than what sometimes happens, is that it falls to one person, but that person already had or has a full-time job. And so they are given the ED&I strategy as an additional thing to do. And that is a massive challenge. So yeah, regardless of whether it's a ED&I specific role or a different type of HR people role that also has ED&I as part of it, I think that these people would need wider company support. And that's where that top-down approach of the CEO being accountable is really helpful. Some organizations have a team of people that's responsible. If it's a large ED&I team, then that's great, that's a bit of a dream. But other organisations have a different approach to creating teams. So that might be staff networks or a forum, or even building up your team of people who look after ED&I by leaning on external expertise. At Culture Shift, through the nature of our mission, we have a lot of people in the organisation who are passionate about ED&I and knowledgeable about it as well. So what makes sense for us at the moment with the size that we are is that it's not just one person's job. And we have a forum which brings together different voices, opinions, experiences, and expertise from different backgrounds across Culture Shift. And I was reading some research that talks about the positive effects of staff networks, and it seems like as far as ED&I initiatives and sharing responsibility goes, they pay off quite highly. There was some Harvard Business Review research that said that task forces see in the 5 years after they have been created, see representation of minority groups in management increase from 9% to 30%, which I thought was quite an astounding increase, actually. Most of the time when we're looking at positive progress in ED&I, we're looking at things like, promotions, representation in promotions going up from like 3% to 3.3% or 4%. It's small incremental changes which are still good, but I thought that was a particularly impressive statistic. And then like I mentioned, working with external experts to build up that team, and bringing in external knowledge. The great thing about that is those types of organizations will work with many other organizations, so you're learning from and taking from examples from people who have done this work before. And then there's an argument to say that embedding ED&I in your organization should be everyone's responsibility. Everyone is diverse, right? And so therefore everyone should care about this. But getting everyone to care about this isn't always particularly easy. A couple of techniques that I've seen work for that. One around using intersectionality to help people understand, that they are diverse, even if they don't class themselves in that way. And to have ED&I embedded in values and behaviours that you talk to people about in their performance reviews. So one thing that we have here at Culture Shift is we have quarterly reviews, we have monthly check-ins, but quarterly reviews where we celebrate people on their behaviours that align with our values. And our values, or at least two of them, are intrinsically linked with inclusion and equity. And so it's a good idea to talk to everyone around those through your values as often as possible. So out of these options, I don't know exactly what will work for your organisation, but what I would say is this needs thinking through, and then within your strategy, there needs to be a clear section that talks about who is accountable, who is responsible, and how you're going to measure the success of this strategy. My third point is about prioritising impactful ED&I initiatives every day. And the point that I really want to make here is I think that we've got to start getting really picky with what work we do as ED&I practitioners and pushing for important and impactful change at every single opportunity. And to do that, we have to be comfortable at making sometimes difficult decisions, and have confidence in having conversations where we defend those decisions and choices. employees in organizations everywhere are feeling pretty burned out, and they're feeling burned out because of many things. But they're feeling particularly morally burned out because of the inequalities and injustices that they're facing or witnessing, either in society or in their own workplaces. And these employees particularly are truly fed up of token gestures. And so what I mean by prioritizing and being picky is, I think we need to start saying thanks, but no thanks to the tokenistic ideas. It's about having those conversations with the CEO who says, they want to decorate the office for Pride Month, and I'm pleased that you want to do that, but actually, I've worked on this strategy, and can you let me put that money to better use elsewhere? And if you think the most important part of your ED&I strategy is going to take you months to work on, then prioritize it. And if in the meantime you don't get a chance to plan that active bystander training session, or you don't get to celebrate Black History Month with a lunch and learn because you're focusing on this really important part that you know is going to be impactful and benefit everyone in the long term, then that's fine. And what I would advise we do in those scenarios is work out what those things would cost the organization and make sure that that spend is ring fenced for later on. So don't let those occasions pass you by without mentioning them, but communicate what you're doing to your C-suite stakeholders. So have a conversation, with the finance director. I'm prioritizing working on our pay gap reporting at the moment. Actually, it's a really big project and I need to focus exclusively on that. So instead of spending £10,000 on this training program that I had previously committed to, and a couple of £1,000 on a lunch and learn, please can we save that £12,000, and that is going to come in handy at the end of my pay gap reporting when we come to correcting those discrepancies. I feel that will be a much more effective use of that spend. And when it comes to embedding ED&I all year round, those type of actions will say so much more about your commitment to an equitable workforce that supports diversity and inclusion than hosting a nice but potentially ineffective event. And these small behind the scenes decisions will improve inclusion and will help with other things that senior leaders care about, like employee retention, happiness, and productivity. That person who is getting paid less than their counterpart for the same job probably had an idea that was happening, probably felt quite disheartened about it, and was probably looking for another job. And so through prioritizing what we're working on and making every single penny and pound count and putting it towards the things that will make impact, you're fixing a really important underlying issue. And what I recommend is when you're having these conversations, it's always best to know your numbers so that you can have conversations that are relevant on a strategic level. So through data and research that's out there, you would be able to say, if we spend this amount on this initiative, it's probably not going to be effective because this and this research says that that's not actually effective in creating long-term change. But if we correct pay gaps, because that's the example that I've gone down, then our return on investment is going to be this, and this. We're going to not lose 5 people from the business and lose all of their skills and experience and have to spend however many thousands of pounds replacing them. So that's a really helpful thing to have in your back pocket, I think, those ROI calculations and figures when having those conversations. That probably leads us quite nicely onto the fourth point, which is around navigating and overcoming resistance. So pushback against DEI initiatives is not new, but I do think that with an increased focus on DEI initiatives these days, it has resulted in more opposition and more polarization. So it feels like doing this work is a lot more intense these days. And I'm sure that that is something that a lot of you on this call have and are experiencing. Again, if that's something that you are comfortable sharing in the chat, then please do. But otherwise, connect with each other afterwards. You know, the power of the community that we're part of ED&I practitioners who sometimes feel lonely in their work, realizing that they're not actually the only ones battling resistance, and that someone else is actually experiencing their very specific pushback challenge is quite powerful. So yeah, please do connect with each other after this. So just to talk a little bit more about the resistance to change, I think what we know about why this feels so much more intense now over the last 3.5 years is that since the COVID-19 pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement gaining global attention, a lot more organisations have started to engage with social issues. And these include conversations about racial injustices, socioeconomic disparities that have been exposed by the pandemic, and lots of other themes which, like I mentioned, can be quite polarising and often which overlap with diversity, equity and inclusion. According to some data that I looked at from Harvard Business Review, 31.4% of employees report that DEI has received more attention within their organisation in the last 2 years. So that just backs up our feeling that commitment to DEI has grown, but so has the pushback to DEI efforts. So 44% of employees agree that a growing number of their colleagues feel alienated by the organisation's DEI efforts. 42% report that their peers view the organisation's DEI efforts as divisive, and another 42% say that their peers resent DEI efforts. They're all pretty high, you know, nearly half of employees pushing back in some way or another to DEI initiatives. And we know that this resentment stems from perceived threats, which there's still a lot more to learn about how these perceived threats manifest themselves in the workplace. But what we do know is that failing to address that pushback can mean losing progress with DEI. There's a helpful framework from Gartner to identify the different types of pushback. And I found that this framework is helpful because once you know the type of resistance that you're experiencing, you can tackle it more effectively then. So are you experiencing denial? Are you hearing comments that really mean this is not my problem? This is not a problem, sorry. So people who just, you know, don't believe in the need for D&I at all. Or are you experiencing disengagement? This is not my problem. People don't resonate with the things that you're talking about. Or is it derailment? So what about other problems? And I think once you know the type of resistance that you're experiencing, you will be able to tackle it more effectively. A little bit on some ways to combat those kind of common types of pushback. So first and foremost, I think a lack of empathy for marginalized groups can enhance these threat perceptions that drive this pushback. And this is one area where training does come in really useful. So those kinds of joint learning activities to build up that level of empathy and awareness of other groups' experiences can help to diminish that sense of threat. Pushback arguments can also be traced back to a lack of clarity on employees' roles in DE&I. So that's the sort of why is this my problem piece. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, I think, around employee resource groups and forums. Leaders can involve employees by making individuals responsible for engaging in DE&I, inviting them to engage in DE&I efforts, so that they become then part of the solution. And communication to obtain buy-in. So, we can't ever assume that all employees will buy into a DE&I initiative, but if you tailor communication to create as much transparency as possible around why a specific program is being rolled out and the events that make the case for that, giving as much context and reasoning as possible, then it is more likely that you will obtain that buy-in. And be sure to communicate that to absolutely everyone, even those employees who are disengaged. I should have mentioned at the beginning, actually, any questions on the content today, please do post in the chat throughout. I'm not sure that we'll get time to answer them before the end because this is only a 45-minute webinar, but what I will do is take them away and answer them via email afterwards. And I'll put my email address at the end of the slides as well. So yeah, if any questions are cropping up throughout the session, please do just post them in the chat. You might already be doing that because I can see lots of comments in the chat, but I can't see the content right now. And then the fifth point that I want to make is around data-driven equality, diversity, and inclusion. And this is what we do at Culture Shift, and this is what we do for over, or help over 100 large organisations do. And that is because being data-driven does work in embedding ED&I all year round. I find that data-driven initiatives move the needle, and you'll be able to showcase success, which is what quite a lot of us are looking for. This work is hard, it's slow to progress, but you want to be able to demonstrate progress, and data can really help you to do that. If you can show through data that you're improving outcomes for people in the organisation, and you're improving things for the organisation, full stop, then you will be able to do more and more work, and ED&I will then become part of the year-round fabric of doing business in your company. And we know that through our clients that collecting and paying attention to data drives more effective action. So the more data that you can get your hand on, the more you will have to do. And I think in creating this ED&I strategy that has a clear purpose, that has someone clearly accountable for it, and has data-driven initiatives within it, you'll soon find that you've filled out, a year at least of activity on plans, and those plans will be informed by data. A few things to think about on the importance and impact of data. So thinking about collection, you and your team need to know why you're collecting data to begin with, and ask yourself, what are you going to do with it? What is that going to inform? We know that that's something that ED&I and HR practitioners find quite challenging in people's strategies. Collecting data in the recruitment process, during onboarding, checking with everyone that data's up to date. Diversity data can obviously change over time. And in order to do that effectively, I think you need to give people a really good reason for parting with that data. So explain how it is going to inform your strategy and your actions going forward. And therefore, there's a really good reason for them to share that with you. Once you've got that, then you need to think about how you can balance the data that people are giving you with their identifying information with any data that you capture anonymously as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about the need for capturing anonymous data in a second. Then thinking about how you're going to monitor and analyze that data to drive change. So how are you going to prioritize investigating if someone lets you know about a problem? How are you going to encourage people to speak up, and how are you going to try and find out more about the issues that people are experiencing in your organization? Are you going to take action every time someone tells you that they've experienced negative behaviours? Are you going to handle that on a more reactive basis, or are you going to have a look at trends over the year and take a more preventative approach to that not happening again in the future? And then just something to think about on publishing data. So when I was doing some research on this, at the moment, only companies of certain sizes have to publish their data on things like gender and ethnicity pay gaps, and other types of ESG reports. But there are a lot of examples of organisations just opting to be more transparent and sharing their diversity data more widely, to encourage good practice. And a lot of culture shift partners do that as well. And it builds trust and transparency with the people in your organisation. It shows your commitment to collecting and utilising that data all year round to improve the culture in the organisation for those people. Could probably direct you to some really good examples of public reports, actually, on public ED&I reports, which I think might be helpful. Some research that we did around anonymous reporting. So, like I say, I think it's important to collect data along with identifying information if possible, but it's equally as important to give people an opportunity to speak up anonymously about things that they're experiencing in the culture in your organisation. And if you give people an opportunity to do this all year round, and you respond to these and you embed it throughout your ED&I strategy, then the ED&I strategy will resonate more with people and will be more effective. So just a couple of statistics that sort of back that up. In a survey that we did, not with partners, just with an external survey that we did with employees in organisations, 30% of employees want a place to provide anonymous feedback. 25% said they want a platform to speak out about bullying and harassment, and 63% said they wouldn't report an incident to their line manager and feel fine about doing that. And everybody said that they would be more likely to speak up about what they're experiencing and barriers they're experiencing in terms of inclusion in the workplace if there was an anonymous place to do that. So it is worth really thinking about. That's time. So I just want to recap on the key takeaways and the things that we've covered today. So number 1, start with strategy. Number 2, hold senior leaders accountable and everyone responsible. Number 3, prioritize the most impactful stuff if you can. Number 4, be prepared for pushback. And point number 5, use data to your advantage. Thank you so much for joining. Like I said, if anyone's got any questions, then feel free to put them in the chat now and we'll capture those and answer them by email, or you can email me directly if you prefer. My colleague is also going to just drop a link to a short survey in the chat, and it is a really short survey. It's literally 3 questions, and I would really appreciate as many people as possible completing that, because that will inform the content of our future webinars as well. Yeah, other than that, bye from me and hope to see you soon. Thanks.